Welcome everyone to this virtual space. So good to see everyone. This special evening with Carol Penner and the launch of her book, Unburdened, a Lenten Journey Toward Forgiveness, published recently by Herald Press. Common Word is pleased to be hosting this event, and we're delighted to see so many of you from near and far. My name is Arlen. I'm the director of Common Word, a national Anabaptist bookstore and resource center, jointly operated by Mennonite Church Canada and Canadian Mennonite University. Carol's book is available to buy or to borrow from Common Word. Please visit commonword.ca. Tonight I am zooming in from Treaty 1 territory. We acknowledge together that we meet on the sacred ancestral lands of First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis peoples, lands ceded, unceded, or under treaty. We make this acknowledgement in respect for the host peoples who have for millennia stewarded these bioregions and watersheds and continue to love and care for the land and waters. We are grateful for them. We commit ourselves to greater learning and the pursuit of a justice that leads to reconciliation. Tonight's conversation is being recorded and will live on Common Word's website and be available to folks who are unable to be here live with us tonight in real time. I welcome future viewers as well. I have muted each of your mics so that there isn't audio interference, and please keep your mics muted. If you need to be in touch with me or have a question for Carol or a general comment, please use the chat function and I will be monitoring that throughout the evening. Toward the end of our program, there will be a question and response time with Carol, and you will have an opportunity to chat your comment or question then. So now I would love to introduce our guest author, Carol Penner. Carol is the Director of Theological Studies at Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, Ontario. She teaches in practical theology. She has also been a pastor within the Mennonite and Mennonite Brethren churches in several provinces. She currently lives in Vineland, Ontario, and is a member of the First Mennonite Church there. She writes regularly for her well-appreciated blog, leadinginworship.com, and has been a long-term volunteer on the binational Together in Worship leadership team. Welcome, Carol. It's great to see you. And congratulations on this wonderful book.
Thanks so much, Arlen, and thank you for offering to host this book launch. I'm so happy to be here and absolutely thrilled to see so many people, some I know and some I don't know, to join me here as we celebrate. I just want to say that the land I live on is in the Niagara Peninsula, and it's the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. It's territory covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and it's within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Thanks everyone for being here.
Carol, forgiveness and the season of Lent are not exactly the lightest or easiest topics or seasons to write about. How did you come to write this book and focus on that theme?
Well, it started because Herald Press approached me and asked me whether I would be interested in doing a Lent devotional book. They were wanting to do a series of those every year for a couple of years. And I was so thrilled to be asked. And they said, what would you like to write about during Lent? And well, sin is an obvious topic to write about in Lent because we think about the crucifixion of Jesus, and Lent is traditionally a time where we think about sin. But I think sin leads to the question of brokenness and what do you do with that, and the need for forgiveness. And I'd written a Bible study series on forgiveness, and I thought about working with that. And I thought, well, sin is connected to what do we do when sin happens? And so I chose the topic of forgiveness. And I pitched it to them and they said, yes, that's a good topic. And it was actually quite funny because I got approached in March and they said, well, we'd like to make it for Lent next year. And that sounded very doable to me. And then they said, well, we need to have the manuscript by June 30th. And then I was like, oh my gosh, that's really quick. And they said, well, we need 6 months to get the book out after you give it to us. And so they said, you can either give it to us this June or next June. And I'm the type of person that I could have worked for 1.5 years on this book and kept revising it 1,000,000 times. And I said, no, I just want to get it done. If I'm doing it, let's just go for it.
And what season of the church year were you writing the book?
I was writing, I started writing it in thinking about it to be in Lent, but then I was writing it in the summer.
Right. You talked about sin. As you know, in many Christian circles, churches tend not to talk much about sin anymore, at least in church circles that I'm most familiar with, and perhaps not as directly as other generations once did. But for you, it's a foundational concept, as you were referencing, to understanding forgiveness. Can you say more about that?
Right. Well, what do we do when there's brokenness? Mennonites have talked quite a bit about sin in the past. You really like to delineate what it was and that you're doing it. And so we don't tend to think about the sin we're doing, but the sin other people are doing. And we like to cast churches out when they are sinful. But we don't hear too many sermons about sin, I think. And what we do hear a lot about is forgiveness in churches, because we need to do something with the sin that happens. Sin happens all the time, and it breaks up communities, it breaks up our lives, and we need to do something with that sin. And forgiveness is one of the ways to do that. But I think we haven't always thought carefully enough about sin and about forgiveness.
And forgiveness, as you've written, is both wild and elusive, you say. By that, I sense you mean that it's not linear or predictable, or a process with a guaranteed, outcome. So could you say a little bit more about this approach to sin, the process of forgiveness, and the mysteriousness, perhaps, of forgiveness?
Right. I think that in some ways, forgiveness is a gift. It comes to us sometimes as a gift, but sometimes we have to do a lot of work to get to forgiveness. And so it's both a gift and something, our hardest work. And we don't always know what we're in for when we start to try to forgive someone. I liken it to climbing a mountain. If you've ever tried to climb a mountain, it may seem very straightforward when you're far away, but once you start doing it, you really are sometimes lost. You can't even see the top of the mountain. And I remember trying to climb a mountain in Switzerland and thinking, I've got to be there, I've got to be there. And we kept going for hours. We eventually had to turn around because we weren't getting to the top. And it was only later when we came down that we looked back and we realized we were climbing a ridge, a mountain ridge. We would never get there. And forgiving someone can be like that too. It's mysterious.
Another thought I had is I think for many of us, we often think of forgiveness as a personal journey or individual journey, being right with God, being right with others, but largely from one's own perspective or one's own responsibility. But is it only private? I think we know that it's not. But what role does the church and the community, faith community, have in a process of forgiveness?
Oh, I think it's really important. And you'll see that from some of the stories I tell in my book about how the church equips people to forgive people, not just by giving them steps or telling them this is the way, but by loving them and supporting them and validating them in their pain when you've been hurt, but also calling us to repentance and helping us walk that long journey when we've hurt someone, to help us realize, what have you done, and being willing to address that.
You talk about accountability in that context as well, right? And I think you have a story or an excerpt that you would like to read.
Sure. I don't know whether all of you have seen the book, but it looks like this. And every day there's 2 or 3 pages of text that to read. And then there's a prayer and some discussion questions. And I'm just going to read one entry from the first week of Lent. And it's called Taking Responsibility. And the focus verse for that is from Genesis 3:12. The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." And then if you were reading this at home, I'd ask you to read Genesis 3:1-13, but I'm not going to do that right now. God calls in the garden, "Where are you?" Adam and Eve are hiding silently among the trees because they did precisely what God asked them not to do. The story invites us to imagine their panic. They don't want to have to explain what they've done. Who wants to admit they've made a mistake? Certainly not Adam. He blames Eve for his actions. She's the one who told me about this. Adam doesn't want to take responsibility. Perhaps Eve doesn't want to either. Some time ago, I backed my car into a tree as I was leaving a church that I had been visiting. My car jerked to a sudden stop with a loud smash, and shocked, I jumped out to survey the scene. At the edge of the parking lot, there was a row of trees in a line. Now, some of you are probably thinking, which church is this? So I'll leave you to think about that. One tree was 2 feet in front of the other trees, the one with my bumper wrapped around it. When I told the story to my family, I drew their attention to the stupidity of the person who planted the trees. I avoided taking responsibility for the collision. I had been careless. It was my responsibility to watch where I was driving, and I failed. I didn't want to carry the weight of what I'd done. Around the time I hit the tree, a man in my church, whom I'll call Evan, sexually abused a young person in the neighborhood. Evan was actually caught committing this crime. When confronted about the obvious abuse, he blamed the child. Many people in our church were very angry because Evan was not taking responsibility for his actions and how he'd hurt that child. I too was angry with him. I spoke with a counselor who specialized in working with people who sexually abused children. The counselor explained that no one wants to admit to abusing a child. There's such a stigma attached to this crime that people who commit the crime will seek someone or something else to blame. Most people who abuse children have a story in their mind explaining why it's not their fault or why the transgression is supposedly okay. It often takes months, if not years, of counseling for the perpetrator to unpack their story and tell the truth, laying the blame where it belongs. Now, our church faced a crisis when Evan was arrested and released on bail pending a trial. Would we allow him to come to church? Some said he could attend only if he admitted what he did was wrong. Basically, they wanted him to stay away and be alone until he figured out how to be repentant. Others thought that we should walk alongside Evan and offer the help he needed to pick up the heavy burden of the harm he had caused. And then I hit the tree. I saw that even though our mistakes are on very different scales, neither I nor Evan wanted to take responsibility. We each came up with a story to show how the wrong we committed wasn't our fault. The stories we tell when we do bad things can be quite far-fetched. I know of several church leaders who sexually abused people in their care. Each one had a story to justify the abuse. I'm in love with my congregant. My job is so hard and I deserve this. Lots of leaders do things like this. We can't all be perfect. Leaders who violate boundaries sometimes tell stories that involve God. God says this is okay, or God wants us to do this. Most people are not supposed to do this, but it's okay for us because God has revealed it to me. They misuse the power given to them as a spiritual leader to mislead a vulnerable victim. I knew an elderly person in my church who was robbed by her grandson. She was in the hospital and had given her debit card to him to pay some bills. When she got out of the hospital, she found that a substantial amount of money was gone from her account. What story did the grandson tell himself when he stole the money? Grandma would probably give me this money if I asked her. Grandma's going to leave me some money in her will, so I'm not stealing it. I'm only taking what's mine. But his actions caused material harm to his grandmother, who now had to borrow money to pay her next month's rent. We choose to hurt people, and Adam-like, we resist and shift responsibility. We leave destruction in our wake. Denial is a burden in itself. We may feel free initially because we aren't shouldering the responsibility for what we've done, but lying to ourselves is a weight that should never be underestimated. I remember sitting with someone who, after long years of denial, suddenly felt the weight of the harm she had caused. It was crushing, and even more crushing because of the time spent evading the truth. She wept as if the weight of the world was upon her. But as in the story of Adam and Eve, God is looking for us. We can think we are hidden, but God knows what we've done and wants us to repent. Clarity is God's Spirit working with us, showing us the invisible chains we've forged that are weighing us down. Every lie forms a link in the chain. Every evasion of responsibility is a weight that pulls us down. God can help with the unburdening, but we first have to admit we've done wrong. Taking responsibility. This is our Lenten journey. And then I have a little prayer, and I'll say that prayer now. God, you know the hoops we jump through, the elaborate stories we tell, the three-ring circus we conjure. We jump up and down, pointing to everyone else. But you know the truth. We can't hide from you. Thank you for helping us when we hide from ourselves. Call us to account for the way we've used our power to hurt others and benefit ourselves. Give us ears to hear your call in the garden. Amen. And then I have a couple of discussion questions that I hope when people read these entries, they'll leave thinking about these questions. And one of them is, can you think of a time when you made excuses for something you did or failed to do? And I have a bunch of other questions there too. There's also a small group discussion guide. If you're reading this with someone else and you want to get together and talk about it, you can read the discussion guide as well. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Carol. And that gives us a picture into both the structure of the book as well as one of the entries. Thank you. I want to just push some of these questions a little further. I mean, we talked about this as not being only an issue or a circumstance around an individual, but also we know that communities themselves sometimes must seek forgiveness as well. Mm-hmm. And in your chapter, Confessing Together, you write that, quote, whole communities need to confess and engage in the forgiveness process. We are often unwittingly part of interlocking systems that perpetuate abuse and harm. Mm-hmm. So what is community sin, and how is a community's forgiveness journey perhaps different from or similar to an individual's process?
Well, that's a really big question, but I do think it's important for us to realize that sin can be something we all do together. And sometimes we do it so in lockstep with each other that we don't even notice that it's wrong for a long, long time. And the fact that we had a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this Zoom meeting is an example of that. That wouldn't have been happening probably 20 years ago. I think Mennonite communities have started to think about the land we live on and the fact that Indigenous people had their land taken from them unfairly. And we need to think about that. And what does it mean to live justly when we realize that sort of inequality? Right. And so the forgiveness journey, I think there are parallels with the individual journey too, because it can take decades for us to repent. It can take decades for us to have accountability or to be able to say sorry to someone. And like we're on these long journeys sometimes. And that's the same with Canadians. I mean, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but that was just like a step. And, you know, there's decades and maybe centuries ahead where we need to think about how do we respond.
You write also about the Old Testament brothers, Jacob and Esau, whose forgiveness did not lead to reconciliation. So many of us, I think, conflate or want to conflate reconciliation with forgiveness. What is the difference?
Well, when someone hurts you, it's like you're chained to them because you think about them all the time and they've harmed you and you can't get away from that hurt. And forgiveness can mean being able to let go of the chains, not that you ever forget the harm done, but that you don't work on resentment and hatred, but you try to let go of that. And I think that that's possible with God's grace. It's not something that we can always do on our own, and it's not something we can always do in our lifetimes. But to think that people must reconcile is not realistic. I mean, here's the people, the brothers, they're not able to get together. They don't live together. They don't live happily ever after. There are stories in the Bible, lots of stories in the Bible where people don't say sorry to each other. And I don't think we're not perfect people either.
And yet we're called to forgive. Mm-hmm. And at times we ourselves long to be forgiven. Mm-hmm. And I think we all share both of those inclinations. It's not an us versus them construct. Both postures are within each of us. Can you say more about how both directions in the forgiveness journey, forgiving and forgiven, relate?
Right. Well, you know, a lot of devotional books, I looked at a lot of devotional books about Lent, talk about sin, and they really want you to look inside and see, how have I sinned? How have I sinned? But in our lives, sometimes our bigger burdens are that we are sinned against. Someone has harmed us in a terrible way. And that's the burden we carry. We carry the burden of having to respond to someone else's sin. And so we are never only the sinned against. We're never only the sinners. It's a give and take there. And so even the Lord's Prayer reminds us that it is a give and take there. And we learn from that. If we're looking seriously at ourselves, it can help us understand someone else's sin as well.
You've already mentioned, Carol, the structure of the book, daily biblical readings, your stories and reflections, a substantive prayer for each day, and questions for reflection, and also this study guide that small groups can use as a tool for their own group conversations. And you're also inviting, and I'll add it to the chat soon, others to join your Facebook book club to kind of engage the book together with you and others. Right. So there's many ways to engage the book. I'm most intrigued that you've chosen to tell a lot of stories.
Yes.
And storytelling can often be quite vulnerable, especially on a topic like forgiveness. Mm-hmm. But what are you hoping these stories, your own stories, stories of others, what will these stories convey?
Well, I hope that the book can change people or help people in some way to reflect on your own experiences in your life. And I felt that how could I ask you to do that if I was unwilling to be vulnerable myself? And so I wrote some of those stories from my own life to show that I'm not the forgiveness expert. I haven't forgiven everyone. I still long for forgiveness from people. I'm not writing from an expert place, but from a place along the journey, and just hoping that people can engage with each other to realize, let's walk with each other on this journey.
Thank you. Those are a few of my questions. I want to invite the rest of this group to engage in the conversation if they so wish. Have you any question or comment for Carol? Please chat your message and I will monitor those and relay them into our conversation. This is your time to ask your question about Unburdened. How did you choose your title, Carol?
Oh, that's a great topic. That's a great question because I didn't choose it. The people at Herald Press are great. Often when you write a book, people who didn't write it have a better view of what it's mostly about. And they've certainly the publishing company has a good idea of what title is catchy and will sell better. And so they chose the topic, the title for me halfway through the book. In fact, it was funny because they like I had to give them installments, like I had to give them the first week's, and then a couple of weeks later I had to give them the next week's, and then they chose the title. And then they gave me the cover of the book that they had made for me, and I still hadn't finished writing the book. And so I had the title and the cover, and it's like, wow, I'd better write this. It's coming out soon.
Are you happy with the title?
Yeah, very. I wouldn't have thought of it. And I actually had used the word a couple of times in my book. And so I was really happy with it.
I
And
know you're very,
especially happy with the cover. I thought,
I was just going to say, I know you're happy with the cover for sure.
oh yeah, I thought it was really great. Reuben Graham is the artist who did that and the graphic designer, and he works at Herald Press, and his name is not in the book, but that's because they have a policy that many people worked on this book at Herald Press, editors and all of the people there, and they all did great work. And so they don't single out any one person's contribution to the book. It's Herald Press.
Jeanette asks, when does it become available? It is already available at Common Word to buy or to borrow. I've just put the link into the chat. Does your book discuss how a person can forgive, especially grievous trauma, deep trauma?
I have a couple of stories about that, and those are examples of extreme examples of how we need to be patient with people, and healing comes in a lifetime, not even in a year. It's a long journey, and that can that's the challenge, right? Is that can congregations walk with people on really long journeys, because people don't even know how they've been hurt at first. And that's one of the problems with churches, is that if they want to go to a quick forgiveness, well, the person hasn't even really explored the pain of what's happened to them. So how can they really forgive? It's only in the years to come, when they realize what they've truly lost, that they realize what needs to be forgiven. So I hope I point at that. I certainly don't have any huge answers to give for that.
What is your favorite chapter or story in the book?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I've pulled out all the stops with all the great stories I have. So I thought, I can't write another book because I put all my best stories in this one. So that's it. So I have some painful stories from my life, but some also that were very transformative for me. And the Canadian Mennonite is actually, it's a periodical in Canada that the Mennonite Church Canada, it's for our constituency. And they're going to be running an excerpt, and it has one of the most powerful stories in it. And I would say that's one of the I'm very happy that that's being shared in the next issue of the magazine.
Do you see a connection between grief and forgiveness? And is there a way that forgiveness can help in the grieving process?
Yeah. That's a really good question. You know, in one of my chapters, I talk about sin as a wall between people, and sometimes people can leap over walls, like miracles can happen. But a lot of times, in order to heal, you have to have steps. You have to build those steps slowly. And I think one of the biggest steps is grief. And we often don't want to go there. We'd rather just leap over that wall and not do grief, because grief is super painful. And you know, the church sometimes doesn't want to sit with people who are grieving for a long time. They'd like them, hey, leap over that wall. Come on, let's go. But grief is really central, as is getting an apology. And sometimes that comes and sometimes that doesn't. Or accountability. Mhm.
Sarah writes, congratulations on this beautiful book, Carol. In going through the process of writing this and writing it in the form of a devotional,
Mhm.
did you learn something new or surprising about the process of forgiveness?
Mhm. Yeah, you know, I did a lot of biblical reflection, and I think I came to some new insights about the Bible that I hadn't seen before, especially about the lack of apologies that we see in the Bible. There's so much brokenness and there's not a lot of sorries. And I think that that's pretty reflective of human life too, that we always have a lot of brokenness and not always a lot of sorries. And yet we have to move on, right? We have to do something with our lives. And how do we go ahead with that? And you know, it was interesting writing the book because I didn't write the whole thing at and then be able to revise the whole thing. I had to write a chunk, and then I had to write a chunk, and then I had to write a chunk. And I kind of had an outline. But as I was getting towards the end, I thought, oh, I could have put this at the beginning. Or I could have put, oh, that first chapter I should have put here, because it isn't linear. It's a real creative process of forgiving, and every person goes through a different journey. And so you could probably start this book at the end and read it backwards and learn a lot too. So
Anyone else? These are great questions.
I'm curious to hear from you. Is forgiveness something that you have felt has been really emphasized in your church more than sin? That's my impression, but I'm curious to think about that.
How has your experience as a teacher impacted how this book was written?
Well, I think I use the pedagogy that I use. Pedagogy, the way I teach, is also the way I wrote the book, in that I try to draw from the Bible. I try to draw from history, from theologians, and also from personal experience, and to craft it in a way that people can connect with it. Because if people connect, if they can say, yeah, then it's going to hit home and you're going to learn something. And so being a teacher really helped me write this devotional book. But I really think that being a pastor is what has influenced me more, because of all the painful stories I heard people tell of sin and wanting to be forgiven, or wanting to figure out how to make it up to someone when you've hurt them. I heard a lot of stories like that. In anyone who's a pastor here will know that that's just human life.
Chip is curious about the writing process. You have done a great deal of writing prayers, liturgical material. We've put a link to your blog and also to Together in Worship. What are the differences and similarities in the process between writing prayers and writing a book?
Oh. Well, writing prayers is it's like poetry for me. It's like trying to really crystallize something. And often I will go back to a prayer many times before I actually get it out there. When I was a pastor, I didn't have the luxury to do that because I had to have a prayer for Sunday. So you do it. But when I'm writing my blog, I'll write a prayer and I'll leave it in my file for months, sometimes years, until I can actually feel that it's ready to launch out into my blog. But with this book, I had to, it was like being a pastor again, because I have a deadline. It's in 3 weeks and I've got to go with this prayer. And it's very, well, God, this is what I have. Here it is. It's a prayer.
Anyone want to comment on Carol's question of what we're hearing in your congregation about sin or forgiveness? What is more prevalent?
Sin.
Sin.
Yeah, I think so. Sin.
I think it depends on the church you're in. Some churches talk more about sin, and some churches are scared to talk about sin. I think there are some churches where the word sin is an S word. They don't even say that word. They'll talk about brokenness, like I have today too. We don't want to name things as sin, but many churches are different than that.
Someone is asking, how would you define sin?
Yeah, Jane, that's a good question.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say turning away from God, turning away from who we're meant to be. And it usually involves pain for ourselves and other people as well. And of course, we turn together like lemmings over a cliff sometimes.
You mentioned the danger of rushing to forgiveness. What do churches need to keep in mind so that they don't prioritize rushing to forgiveness over the protection of victims?
Right. I'm a professor at Conrad Gable College, and the theme for our month of sermons in the chapel right now is mystery and messiness. I think that's the chip vendor is doing the chaplaincy there right now. And I think mystery and messiness kind of sums it up, that churches would like things to be cut and dried. Sometimes we would like that pain to stop. We would like people to stop grieving. We would like to move on and stop thinking about that hurt. And can't we start a new chapter? Let's do some more fun things, more exciting things than, dealing with pain and suffering. And yet that is so much of what forgiveness is about, is delving into what has happened here, what needs to happen for healing to move forward, and dealing with our feelings, dealing with our emotions, and especially rage and huge grief. Ooh, Mennonites are my Russian Mennonite, Swiss Mennonite experience of Mennonites is that we can be pretty buttoned down with our emotions in church. We don't want to talk about that.
Sometimes it seems the words like injustice, brokenness, trauma become substitutes for the word sin. And is there something special about the word sin that is missed in those words?
Well, no, I think those words are important for unpacking what it is, and maybe it relates better to us when we use those words. The word sin is pretty biblical. I think we lose something of our biblical heritage if we don't want to use that word. But I do understand that sin has been overplayed in some contexts, and people have felt so guilty, even when they shouldn't, because they've been told how terrible they are. And for those people, the word sin has so much baggage. It's maybe not healthy to use it. And so, pastors have to make really important choices on what language to use when we talk about turning from God.
is sin a simple thing? It seems that many people think forgiveness, or is forgiveness a simple thing? It seems that many people think forgiveness should be a simple thing, not necessarily easy, but straightforward, I suppose. But I'm not sure how much people want to work at forgiveness. It's like if a person just says sorry, then we can say you're forgiven, but it seems that such simplicity would miss the healing.
Right, right. Well, I think we do experience moments of simple forgiveness in our lives. We definitely do, even sometimes of hard things where God gives a gift and we can just feel a release, a rush of, I've let it go. I've let it go. And, thankfully that does happen in our lives, but it doesn't always happen. Like Jesus healed people who were blind, he just touched them and they're not blind anymore. Fabulous. Well, but a lot of people have to go get glasses, right? A lot of people have to live with poor vision or live without sight. And that's part of the reality too. We aren't in control of when forgiveness always happens. And it is a lot of work. Are we willing to do that work? And, sometimes I understand it's just like, too hard. I've got to put this down for a while. And that's why it can take decades, right? Because it's like, I just can't deal with this anymore. I've got to stop thinking about it. So we stop thinking about it for 5 years, but then something else happens and you think, gee, still haven't dealt with that. And that's why sometimes people get apologies many years later. And I have a story in the book of someone whose family gets an apology 40 or 50 years after something happened because the person took a long time to realize they needed to say sorry.
We have a couple more here. Sometimes the more conservative Mennonite traditions in the past and also present have not prioritized forgiveness. Instead, excommunication, shunning were solutions. One of my family members, this person says, experienced that over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Mennonites have a painful history with sin and with forgiveness. And I would say that continues to today in the Anabaptist Church, that casting people out. We're I would say Anabaptists are casting out specialists. We're really good at that. And yet the body of Christ is one, and we are called to unity. And any division we make now will be healed in the future. That's God's trajectory. And so forgiveness will happen eventually, we hope, but it can take a long time. And we've seen that in Mennonite churches, that conferences that were far apart for a long time did eventually come together.
What do you mean by specialist? Just a follow-up question.
Casting out specialists. We've cast each other out so much. We really know how to do it well. There's so many little slivers of Mennonites, sliver denominations, because we can't stand each other. You're too sinful for me. I have to go apart from you. And so if you look at the branch of the Anabaptist tree, it has a lot of little twigs with each little type of church. And I see that as a symptom of sinfulness too. It's so ironic, right? Because people are casting people out because of sin, and yet the casting out, that desire to cast out is itself can be sinful, I think.
What comes after forgiveness? What is necessary for the forgiver, for the forgiven, the congregation that has witnessed the grace of forgiveness?
Oh, joy. Joy. Thank God. Thank God it's come at last. That's a moment to celebrate. That's a moment to celebrate. And yet, in our humility, I think too, we sometimes don't want to talk about forgiveness that's happened, because we'd have to talk about how deep the hurt was. And I tell some stories about people who go through that long forgiveness journeys.
Does forgiveness not require restoration of relationship? For me, this is a struggle. As though I value a relationship, I'm not certain I have the inner fortitude to do the work.
Right, right. And I would say no. I would say that sometimes forgiveness means just walking away. And it's okay. We don't have to be together anymore, but I'm not going to hold it against you. But I'm not getting back together with you. We're not going to be best friends. And Jacob and Esau is one of those stories that I tell about that, and that's okay. And I think it's unfair of the church to put huge burdens on people to reconcile, because sometimes it's just not safe to reconcile. When we've experienced harm from someone, to go back to be with them, that's not safe. But you can forgive them for what they did. You can say, well, I understand why they did it, or I won't hold it against them, but I'm not going to put myself in a place where they're going to hurt me again. And that's okay to have boundaries for yourself. I think God is fine with that.
And how are those boundaries different than another denomination or another splinter group or that type of thing? Like when you say it's okay to, as a victim who can't be in the same
Yeah.
Esau can't be in the same presence
Right.
of Jacob,
Right.
or vice versa, and yet how is that any different than this denomination group not being in the presence of another denomination?
Right, right. And I would say that's why denominations don't get back together in that generation.
Yeah.
I mean, it sometimes takes a couple of generations for those splinters to heal because the harm is too great. People have been, trust is shattered, hurt is too deep. I can't worship with those people anymore because of that terrible separation. But maybe the next generation can get back together. And I've seen that in my own community. There was a lot of animosity between Mennonite Brethren and General Conference Mennonites in my own community, where they didn't even, one denomination didn't even recognize that the other people were baptized. They made them rebaptize if they were going to join their church. And that was healed. It took a couple of generations, but we had a healing ceremony in Vineland to talk about. We used to cast each other out, and now we don't do that. And, you know, it was a real healing moment in my local community to do that.
And full of joy, as I think you said earlier.
Yeah.
And as you also said, the kind of God's wider trajectory, right? That all things will be restored.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
Thank you, Carol, for engaging us all in a great conversation. It's been a good evening. And I want to thank you also for leading us into the coming Lenten season, which is just around the corner, remarkably, and providing such a valuable resource for the church. As I said earlier, it's available at Common Word to borrow or to buy. May our Lenten journey this year be an opportunity to orient ourselves toward Easter and the possibility of new life in Christ. Mm-hmm. May we each take steps away from brokenness and into the healing and hope of the resurrection. Mm-hmm. That is our prayer. I'll pass the virtual mic to Carol for her last word. Thank you all for coming. Carol.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you all for coming, and to Herald Press for inviting me to write this book. But I want to thank all the people who have loved me and forgiven me for how I've hurt them, and who've walked with me in these journeys in the church, the churches I pastored, the place I teach. These are all rich grounds for us to experience God's grace. And I hope the book reflects how thankful I am for all of the people who've come into my life. Thanks for being here.